Arizona Territory, spring of 1879. The sun hung low over the desert like a warning, and Hester Rowley knew her stepbrothers were about to ruin her life. She stood outside the crumbling adobe station house near Fort Bowie, arms crossed tight, her cotton dress tugged by the hot wind. Her boots were caked with dry red dirt from the long ride, and her throat burned from dust and silence. She had not spoken since dawn, not to them. "You sure this is the place?" Amos asked, squinting toward the low hills. His voice was too loud, too eager. "It is." Griffin pointed to the man approaching from the trail, tall and lean, wrapped in a long coat despite the heat. He led 2 horses. "That's him." Hester's stomach turned. "You said we were going to visit Aunt Me." Griffin turned to her, his face already growing hard. "Do not speak." They had never been kind. She had been 16 when their father married her mother, and when he died from fever 2 years later, they claimed the land and shut her out. She had stayed only because her mother was still alive, but she passed last winter, and now they had her alone. The man who arrived was not what she expected. He was older, white, with pockmarked skin and narrow eyes that moved too fast. He looked her up and down. "Too skinny," he muttered, "but I will take her." Hester stepped backward. "What are you talking about?" Griffin grabbed her arm. "You will do what you are told." "No," she said, yanking free. Amos moved behind her, ready to shove her forward, then the stranger's chest jolted. He gasped, staggered, and fell an arrow through his throat. Chaos broke loose. Amos shouted, Griffin cursed. Hester ducked, heart hammering. Another arrow flew, striking the ground beside her boot. Then a man stepped out from behind a boulder, tall, copper-skinned, with black hair tied back and a rifle steady in his hands, his eyes locked on hers. "Run," he shouted. She did not think. She ran. The Apache scout fired once more, and Amos dropped to the ground screaming, clutching his leg. Griffin fled toward the horses, but the scout ignored him. He ran after Hester, catching up fast. "Come," he said, grabbing her hand. They ran together into the dry hills, winding between rocks and brush, up into a narrow canyon where horses could not follow. When they finally stopped, she fell to her knees, gasping. He crouched beside her, watching the trail below. His rifle rested on his knee. "Who are you?" she asked. "Viho Tenay," he said. "Scout for the army, but not today." She blinked at him, trying to understand. "Why did you help me?" "I saw them. I knew what they were doing." His voice was calm, but his jaw clenched tight. "I followed them since they left Apache Pass." Hester wiped sweat from her face. "They were going to sell me." "I know." She looked down at her torn skirt, her scratched hands. "I did not think anyone would stop them." "They will not try again." She believed him. They stayed in the canyon until dusk. Viho shared a small pouch of dried meat and a canteen of water. He gave her his coat, folding it gently around her shoulders when the wind cooled. He did not ask her questions, did not touch her without cause. He simply sat close enough to keep her safe. When the sun dropped behind the hills, he stood. "We must move. There is a place north, a friend with horses." "You cannot go back." "I know," she said. They walked by starlight. The desert was quiet, except for the crunch of their boots and the wind brushing through low mesquite. Viho moved like he belonged to the land, sure-footed and silent. Hester stumbled more than once, but he always steadied her with a glance or a hand beneath her arm. Hours later, they reached a small camp tucked in a dry arroyo. Another Apache man waited there, older, with a kind smile and 2 saddled horses. He looked at Hester, then at Viho, and nodded. They rode through the night. When morning came, they stopped near a spring where cottonwoods grew and the water ran clear. They drank, washed, and ate again. Hester sat on a flat rock, watching Viho clean his rifle. "You could have left me." "I would not." "Why?" He looked up, met her eyes. "Because they looked at you like you were nothing, and I saw you fight back." She felt her throat tighten. "I was afraid, but you still fought." They rested through the heat of the day. Hester dozed in the shade while Viho kept watch. When she woke, he handed her a small piece of cornbread from his pack. She smiled, and he smiled back, a quiet thing that made her chest feel warm. By the time they reached the next town, a small trading post near the San Pedro River, 2 days had passed. Viho spoke to the storekeeper in Spanish while Hester waited outside. She watched him from the porch, the way he moved with quiet confidence, the way people looked at him with respect. He came back with a wrapped bundle. "Clothes for you and boots that fit." She blinked at him. "Why are you still helping me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I want to." She changed behind the store. The dress was rough cotton, plain but clean. The boots were worn but better than hers. When she stepped out, Viho stared at her a second longer than before. They set up a small camp by the river that night. Viho built a fire and Hester helped gather kindling. When it was burning low, she sat beside him, their shoulders barely touching. "Do you have family?" she asked. He hesitated. "I did, they are gone." She nodded. "Mine too." The silence between them was not heavy, it felt like something shared. "Where will you go now?" he asked. "I do not know." She looked at him. "Where are you going?" He turned toward her. "There is a place I know, near the White Mountains, quiet, safe." She waited. "I could take you there if you want." She nodded slowly. "I want." When she lay down that night beneath the stars, she was not afraid, and when she woke the next morning to the sound of Viho's voice and a cup of hot coffee in her hands, something inside her felt new. Like she was not alone anymore. They rode north through the highlands, where the land softened into pines and cool air, and the sky stretched wide without judgment. Spring crept up the valleys in green hushes, willow buds, cold creeks, snowmelt turning dry beds to rivers again. Hester had never seen this kind of quiet. Not since she was a child. Viho kept to the smaller trails. His silence was careful, not closed, and when he spoke, it was with the same precision he used to set traps or check the wind. "You ride well," he said one afternoon as they climbed a narrow ridge. "I had to," Hester answered, adjusting her grip on the reins. "When my mother was dying, I'd ride to town for laudanum and bread. It was 30 miles each way." He looked over. "That's a hard thing," she nodded once. "I was 17. They didn't say more." The ridge leveled out, and the horses picked their way through a stretch of shale. Later, they stopped by a sheltered spring where wild mint grew thick along the edge. Viho showed her how to boil it into tea. She watched his hands, the way he folded the leaves, the angle of the tin cup over the flame. There was no wasted motion. "Who taught you that?" she asked. "My grandmother. She raised me after my father was killed." Hester wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "How old were you?" 5. The wind moved through the pines above them, and neither of them spoke for a while. When the tea was gone, Viho added more wood to the fire and laid his rifle across his lap. "Do you want to be alone tonight?" he asked. She looked at him carefully. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you've had no time to choose anything yet." The fire cracked. She watched the small sparks rise. "I don't want to be alone," she said. That night, he slept close by, not touching, just near enough that she could hear his breathing when the coyotes called far off. She closed her eyes, knowing there was no one left in the world who could take her from this place. By the 4th day, the land told them they were nearing the White Mountains. Snow still clung to the shaded ravines, but the days were warm enough to ride without coats. Hester's face browned under the sun, and her hands no longer blistered from the rains. They passed a burned-out homestead, mid-morning charred beams, rusted tools scattered in the weeds. Viho slowed. "This was a friend's place," he said. "A soldier patrol passed through here last year, accused them of hiding my people. Burned it down when they didn't find proof." Hester walked her horse closer. "Did they live?" The wife and boy made it to Fort Thomas. The father didn't. She dismounted and picked up a bent kettle from the ashes. She set it upright on a flat rock as though that might count for something. Viho watched her, silent. They made camp that evening near a creek that ran cold and fast. She rubbed her feet dry after crossing, and Viho stitched a tear in her saddlebag without being asked. "You think they'll follow?" she asked, not looking up. "Griffin's a coward. He'll tell people you ran off with a drifter. That will satisfy him. And Amos, he'll be limping a long time if he rides at all." She didn't ask how he knew the arrow had struck bone. She just nodded. After they ate, she sat beside him, the fire low between them. "What's the place like?" Where we're going, high meadow. Elk come through in the fall. My uncle's old cabin stands there, it's small, but the roof holds. There's a spring nearby, enough land to plant if someone wanted. She looked at his face in the firelight. And do you want that? He met her eyes. Not before. And now, he let out a long breath as though he hadn't realized he'd been holding it. Now I think I might. She reached for his hand. He didn't flinch when she touched him. Is it strange, she said softly, that I trust you more than I have anyone? No, he said. It's not strange to trust what saves you. They didn't move apart. The fire burned down, and when she leaned her head against his shoulder, he rested his cheek on her hair like it was the most natural thing in the world. Morning came with birdsong and frost on the grass. Viho handed her a strip of dried meat and pointed toward the distant peaks. By nightfall, we'll be there. And she knew, without doubt, that he meant more than the land. The trail narrowed beneath the horses' hooves, winding through a grove of young aspens that whispered against one another in the breeze. Their leaves shimmered pale green in the morning light, and the air was cool enough that Hester kept her shawl drawn close around her shoulders. Her limbs ached from days of riding, but she said nothing. Viho rode ahead, his eyes always scanning the slope above. He didn't speak unless he had reason, but she had grown used to the silence between them. It was never cold. By midday, the trees thinned and the land opened into a high basin hemmed in by dark ridgelines. The cabin stood near the base of a low hill, its logs weathered to silver, the roof heavy with pine shingles. Smoke hadn't touched the chimney in years, but the walls still stood square. Viho dismounted first. Wait here, he said, handing her the reins. He crossed the clearing in long strides and pushed the door open with his shoulder. A bird startled from the rafters and flew out past him, vanishing into the trees. He stepped inside. A few moments later he returned. No nests. No rot. We'll need to clear out some leaves. Hester tethered the horses near a stand of scrub pine and knelt to untie the bundles strapped behind the saddle. Viho had already fetched a branch broom from behind the cabin and was sweeping the threshold when she joined him. The inside smelled of dust and dry wood. A stone hearth stood at one end, with a narrow cot against the far wall. The shutters creaked when Viho opened them, letting in the smell of sun-warmed grass and melting snow. A thick layer of pine needles coated the floor, but beneath them the planks were solid. He nodded toward the corner. There's a root cellar down there. I'll check it. She watched him lift the hatch and climb down carefully. A moment later he called up, a few jars still sealed. Beans and something pickled. She crouched beside the trapdoor. Not bad for being left alone through 2 winters. He surfaced with a dusty jar in each hand and set them on the table. We'll add to it. Spring's early this year. They worked until dusk, sweeping, airing, stacking wood. Viho repaired the cot's frame while Hester shook out the old wool blanket and beat it clean. When her fingers began to stiffen from the cool, he handed her a pair of buckskin gloves from his pack. They belong to my uncle, he said, but they'll fit you. She slipped them on. Thank you. That night, they cooked over the fire inside beans boiled with wild onion and a strip of dried meat Viho softened in water. They ate seated on the hearth, knees drawn up, the firelight painting their faces in gold and shadow. Viho set his bowl aside. You'll be safe here, she stared into the flames. I believe you, he glanced toward the door. There's a ridge north of here where the grass grows knee-high. You could keep goats or plant root vegetables along the creek. I've never kept animals. You could learn. She looked over. Would you teach me? He met her eyes. Yes. A long moment passed between them, then she spoke again, her voice low. When we were riding, you said you hadn't wanted this place before. I didn't. Why not? He rested his forearms on his knees. It reminded me of everything I lost. My uncle built it after they took our land from the basin. He said he didn't need more than this. I didn't believe him then. And now, Viho looked at her steady. Now I understand. A place doesn't have to be big to hold peace. She nodded, then leaned back against the stones of the hearth. I never thought I'd have a home again, not one I chose. You did choose this, he said. I chose you. He didn't speak, but something in his face changed, not surprise, not hesitation, just quiet understanding like a door opening. He rose and added another log to the fire. Then he sat beside her again, closer this time. She didn't move away. "I've never had someone see me," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Not really, not even my mother. She loved me, but she didn't know me." Viho turned toward her. "I see you." She reached for his hand slowly, as if afraid the moment might vanish, but when she touched his fingers, he laced them through hers without pause. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and earth through the shutter cracks. Inside, they sat with their hands clasped, firelight warming their skin. Viho's voice was soft. "You could stay here if you wanted." Hester didn't hesitate. "I want to." There was no more need for speech after that. When he leaned forward and kissed her, it was not sudden and it was not shy. It was the kind of kiss that came after days of shared silence and hard riding, after trust built in small, careful steps. She pressed her hand to his jaw, and he rested his palm over her ribs, where her breath moved steady beneath the wool. They fell asleep that night in the cot, her head tucked beneath his chin, his arm curved around her back. The wind outside rose and fell, but the cabin held steady. No one would come looking for her now, and if they did, they would find a woman who no longer needed saving. The first true rain came 5 days after they reached the cabin. It swept down from the ridges in long, silver threads, soaking the high grass and washing clean the dust that had clung to the porch. Hester stood in the doorway and watched it fall, her arms folded tight against the chill, the hem of her skirt damp where it brushed the floorboards. Inside, Viho split kindling. The sharp thock of the hatchet echoed softly beneath the steady drumming on the roof. "You ever seen a summer storm in these mountains?" he asked without looking up. "No," she said. "Back home the rain came hard and mean, never stayed long." He set the blade aside and carried the bundle of wood to the hearth. "Here it settles in slow, soaks the earth deep. Makes the roots hold stronger." She stepped back in and closed the door behind her. "I'd like that, to feel something lasting." He lit the fire again, coaxing the flame from a twist of bark. She crouched beside him, warming her hands. The smoke curled steadily upward, caught in the draft. That evening, with the wind still high and the sky slate colored through the shutters, Viho brought down a roll of oilskin from the loft. Inside it were a handful of carved figurines animals, mostly, shaped from antler and worn smooth by time. "My uncle made these when he was trapped in the canyon one winter," he said, laying out a bear, a hawk, and a thin-legged deer. Snow was too deep to hunt. He said carving kept his hands from forgetting how to work. Hester picked up the deer and turned it over in her palm. "They're beautiful," he nodded. "He never sold them, said they weren't for trade." She set it down gently. "You could teach me to carve. I've only ever stitched or pressed herbs." "I will," he said. "But your hands don't need to prove anything." She looked at him then, something quiet and certain in her gaze. "I want to make part of this place mine." Viho didn't answer right away. He reached into the oilskin again and pulled out a small square of cloth, folded twice. He held it out to her. When she opened it, she found a beaded band dark red and bone white with a narrow pattern of peaks stitched into the center. "My grandmother made that for my mother," he said. "It's the only thing I kept after our home was burned." She swallowed. "Why give it to me?" "Because you're not passing through. You're part of this place now." She traced the beadwork with the pad of her finger. "Then I'll make something for you in return." They didn't speak much the rest of the night. When they climbed into the cot, the rain still tapped gentle against the roof. Viho wrapped an arm around her waist, and she tucked her face beneath his collarbone, her breath slow and even. In the morning, the clouds had broken, and the world outside was green and shining. The creek ran louder than before, and the trail was soft with mud. Hester stepped outside to hang their linens on a line between two pines, the damp cloth heavy in her hands. Viho was sharpening his knife on a flat stone near the porch. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and his eyes followed the blade's edge with quiet focus. "I've been thinking," Hester said, looping the last sheet on the line. He looked up. About what? There's an old stovepipe behind the cabin. If we dug a trench and set stones around it, we could build an oven, a real one. He set the knife down. You've done that before? No, she said, but I saw one once. A woman outside Prescott had it set into the hill. She baked bread every week. Viho stood and wiped his hands on his trousers. Then we'll try it. They worked side by side that day digging, hauling stones from the creek edge, measuring the slope of the ground with their palms. Hester's arms ached by sundown, but she didn't complain. Her dress was streaked with clay, and Viho's shirt was soaked through at the collar. But neither of them stopped until the trough was set and the base stones laid. When they finally sat on the porch steps, the sky was streaked gold. Hester leaned her head against his shoulder, her braid damp and loose against her back. Viho reached into his pocket and pulled out a small strip of leather. He began braiding it slowly, his fingers sure. I've never lived with someone before, he said quietly. Hester didn't lift her head. I haven't either, not like this. There are things I don't know how to say, not in English, not always in my own words either. You don't need to say them, she said. I see them, in how you make space for me, in how you listen. He nodded, not speaking again for a long time. The sun dipped lower and the first stars began to show. That night, after the fire burned low and the ashes cooled in the hearth, Viho placed the braided leather on her side of the shelf above the bed. She didn't ask what it meant. She didn't need to. The next morning they rose with the light and went back to work. The oven would take days to finish, and there were seeds to sort, tools to mend, traps to set. But when Hester caught Viho watching her from across the clearing, a quiet certainty settled in her chest. She hadn't just found safety. She'd found a life that could be hers. The oven held its heat for the first time by early June. Viho crouched beside it, watching the coals settle deep into the clay-lined belly. Hester stood with her hands on her hips, flour dusting the front of her apron, a round of dough rising in the tin basin at her feet. It's ready, he said, touching the outer stone with the back of his fingers. She nodded, stepping forward to knead the dough one last time before shaping it onto the flat board. Her arms moved with certainty, her sleeves rolled above the elbow, her braid tucked through her belt to keep it from falling forward. Viho opened the iron door they had salvaged from the old stovepipe, and she slid the dough inside with care. They waited together, seated on the low bench they'd built from pine planks, the scent of baking bread rising between them. She leaned back, stretching her legs. I never thought I'd build something from the ground up, not with anyone. You never wanted to, he asked. I never thought I was allowed to want that. Wanting something meant someone could take it. He didn't answer right away. The wind stirred the tops of the trees and a raven passed overhead, its wings steady against the blue. What do you want now? He asked. She turned toward him. To keep choosing. Every day, this life, this place, you. His lips parted slightly, not in surprise but in quiet recognition. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded bundle wrapped in deerskin. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a narrow ring carved from antler, its surface burnished smooth. I've been working on this since the snow melted, he said. Didn't know if it was too soon. She took it, cradling it in her palm. It's not. I don't have a preacher, he said. I don't need one. He looked at her for a long moment, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. Then let it be today. She slipped the ring onto her finger. It already is. The bread came out golden, its crust crackling as it cooled. They ate it warm, hands touching now and then as they tore pieces, their laughter low and unhurried. Later that afternoon, Viho brought down the last of the seed bundles they'd saved. They knelt together at the edge of the clearing where the soil had been turned weeks ago, rows already marked by sticks and twine. Hester pressed her fingers into the dirt, planting each seed with care, her eyes focused. I used to think planting was giving something away, she said. But now I see it's the opposite. Viho worked beside her, laying the beans in shallow furrows. It's a promise. They finished the garden before dusk and walked down to the creek where the air was cooler and the rocks warm underfoot. Hester lifted her skirts to her knees, stepping into the shallows. Viho sat nearby, watching the water rush past. She looked back at him. "What comes next? We build a fence around the garden," he said. "Maybe add a second shelf in the cabin. You'll need a place for your things." She waded to the bank and sat beside him. "I already have everything I need." That night they lay in the cot, the windows open to the breeze. The smell of pine and earth drifted in. Hester rested her hand on Viho's chest, her fingers splayed over his heartbeat. "I've never felt like I belonged anywhere," she said. "Until now, you belong here," he said. "With me." She closed her eyes, the rhythm of his breath steady beneath her palm. Through the summer, they shaped their home in quiet, steady hours. They built a second chair and a low table from cedar, stitched curtains from an old flour sack, and traded with a rancher 3 ridges over for 2 hens and a weathered milk goat. Viho repaired the roof shingles before the first hard rain, and Hester taught herself to make blackberry jam from the thickets near the creek. When the chill of early autumn came, they gathered wood and patched the chinks in the walls. Viho carved her a comb from juniper, and Hester sewed him a shirt from coarse cotton she'd bartered for at the post. They didn't speak of the past, not anymore. It had no place between them. One evening, as the leaves began to turn, Viho stood at the edge of the clearing watching the sky shift to dusk. Hester stepped beside him, her hand finding his. "There's nothing missing," she said. He nodded. "We've made something whole." When snow finally dusted the ridge, they sat by the fire, the dog they'd taken in curled beneath the table, the shelves full with what they'd grown and stored. Hester mended a glove while Viho read the worn pages of a book left by his uncle, his voice low and even. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, but the cabin stood warm. Years passed, marked by seasons and small things. The creek froze and thawed, the hens grew old and were replaced, and the garden stretched wider each spring. They never spoke of leaving. They didn't need to. One cold morning, Viho placed a new carving on the mantel, 2 figures standing side by side, their arms linked. Hester ran her fingers over the shape of it, her smile soft. "Looks like us," she said. "It is." And she kissed him then, slow and sure, the fire behind her crackling low, the morning light turning her hair to gold. They stayed like that in the quiet and the warmth where nothing was taken and everything was chosen. Together. Always.